Good evening, welcome back to Tekton Zoo. I'm ZSH Plays, and we've got a lot to discuss today. So the reason for that is we are starting a new area in our zoo today. But before we do that, next weekend, myself and many other creators are coming together to raise money for a zoo and conservation program. Now, the zoo's called Kango Wildlife Ranch. They're in South Africa, and they run breeding programs to save and maintain the genetic diversity of the cheetah. They've had some of the severest lockdowns in the world, so consequently they're now struggling even to feed their animals. So that is where we come in. Next week's episode, we're going to be building an amazing new habitat and conservation centre for our zoo, and I'll be asking you to donate to Kango if you're able. Anyway, more about that next week. Let's move on to Tekton Jungle. So here we are back in the Grand Plaza. It's been a while since we were here. This is one of the original ideas that I had for the zoo. I'm going to be honest, when I first came up with the concept for this zoo, I did not plan the entire zoo out. I know some people like to do that, which makes perfect sense. But to be honest, I'd spent so long working on London Zoo in 1985. I was really eager to just get started with something new. I had the concept, I knew where it was going to be, I knew what the aesthetic of the zoo was going to be. So I just planned really the Grand Plaza, the forest to the left of it as you come in, and the jungle to the right of it. The rest of it we're going to make up as we go along. I've got quite a few ideas for different areas and different exhibits, etc., but this is the second of the two main areas that I'd planned out. So kind of difficult to build an outdoor jungle in a zoo based in England, as anyone who is either from England or has been to England knows. It gets pretty cold here, but it also gets pretty hot in the summer. It's not unusual for it to be 30 degrees. It's quite common for tropical animals to be kept outside in England. You just need to make sure that they've got sufficient indoor areas that are heated for when it gets properly cold. So I've selected the species that will be going into this jungle pretty carefully. The plant life, I mean, I am not a botanist. If you know more than I do about botany, which would not be hard, you'll probably notice numerous trees and plants in this enclosure that would be dead within about 3 seconds of a British winter. So we're just going to say those are fake trees. I'm sure you can get some pretty realistic fake trees these days. So what I'm doing here is building a waterfall. We've already got one waterfall in the zoo, but that was a kind of crazy modernist construction. What I'm trying to do here is build a natural one. So I'm channeling my inner Mike Sheets here and trying to do a load of rock work and some a specimen plant, I believe it's called, at the top, and just making a waterfall that looks natural. It wouldn't actually be natural, although there are lots of beautiful waterfalls in England. It's pretty unlikely that there'd just be one in the middle of the field that they built the zoo in. So this is a lot of I don't know if it'd be fake rocks or real rocks that you moved in, but that's the plan. This jungle is going to look, or it should look, a lot more naturalistic than the forest on the other side. With that, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out in regards to the enclosures sitting in the forest and contrasting nicely with all the vegetation. But it's very much, sort of a flat area full of the habitats and then trees, shrubs, plants, etc. in between them. For this one, I want it to be more striking looking, so almost like you could happily wander around it even if there was no habitats in it. Whether I'll achieve that or not, I don't know. We'll have to see as we work on it over the coming weeks. I'm going to put a pool in here below the waterfall, and then lots and lots of plants all over it, so it looks natural. Spent a lot of time building this. I probably spent, well, actually, you'll see the paths in a minute, and that took some doing. But this waterfall, I probably spent about as much time on this as I did on the habitat that we're going to build in a bit. We are going to build a habitat today, the first one in the jungle. Going forward, as I mentioned at the start, next week we're going to be doing a very special episode with a completely new area of the zoo that I've designed especially for Kangathon. But once we've got that in, I would like to move to working on different areas of the zoo each week, rather than building the whole area over a long series of episodes like we did with the forest. So we have Tekton Desert, we've started that with the meerkats. We're going to have a whole complete area built in one episode next week, and then after that we'll be able to switch between the jungle, the desert, and then future areas or future one-off habitat builds that I've got in mind. So loads and loads of rock work here. People always say you should use more than one colour of rock to create things, and I sort of struggle with that, to be honest. I don't know if it's just the way I build, but it never really looks right for me when I use lots of different colours or use sort of equal amounts of two different colours. So with this, it's almost entirely built from, I think it's the tropical rocks, and then I just squeeze in a few other coloured rocks, mossy rocks at the top obviously because that's where the water is, and then mainly one colour after that. I just find it gels better, but that's probably more to do with my building than whether you should use more than one or not. And then I take a section of the waterfall and I just use this one section over and again, spinning it round and then moving the plants around to disguise the fact that it's one copy pasted area. And I think when it's finished it doesn't look like it's just one big lump that's been copied loads of times. I hope. We'll have to see, but I think it looks pretty decent when it's done. And this is all surrounding one of the biggest, in fact the biggest habitat that is going to be in this jungle, which we will not be getting to today. That is for a future episode, but I'm really excited about that one. It's an animal that I've never used before. This here that we're working on now is today's habitat. So this is going to be a habitat for red-ruffed lemurs to complement the ring-tailed lemurs that we have in the forest. In the middle here, where that depression I just made is, that is going to be a mixed species habitat, which we'll again get to in a later episode. I'm using raised paths here to make it more interesting than the forest was. And we're going to get some custom fencing in a minute, which drove me absolutely insane. You'll see why in a minute. It's dead simple, it's not even complicated, but just the way that I made, just sort of placed the paths in lots of nice looking curves with reckless abandon, and then realised that meant I would have to place the fence pieces pretty much individually, and that was not a quick job, even by my standards as the world's slowest builder. That took a long time. I've put one of the new reward statues in, which I've never used before, in the entrance here, which I think looks pretty nice. And this is the fence. Now this fence is based on a fence in a park in China, which I really liked. It's like a really, I don't know if it's, I imagine postmodernist is the term that would be used for it rather than modernist, but it's really in your face. It's bright red, obviously being Chinese. It is not a path designed to sit into the background and not be noticed. It is a path designed to blow your socks off. I've made it a little more subtle. It's going to be a light grey when it's finished, but I just thought it was a really nice design. I wanted to get that into the zoo. Using the new mesh pieces here, again, I love these pieces. These are going to separate under the path the mixed habitat in the centre and the lemur habitat that we're working on today, and stop the little guys from getting out. I just run this all the way under the path so that it can't be seen by the guests. Like I said, I'm going for a much more naturalistic look in the jungle than I did in the forest. It's going to be pretty much all naturalistic, and then there's going to be a giant modernist centrepiece habitat at the end by the waterfall. I'm concentrating on sight lines as well, making sure that you can see the waterfall from everywhere that you stand, hence the raised paths. I'm using some of the concrete barriers here, which I used a lot of in London Zoo 1985. I've not used them at all in Tekton Zoo. I use the plaster for everything, which is sort of standing in for concrete because it bizarrely looks more like concrete than the concrete does. But those concrete barriers I thought actually looked pretty fitting at the back, and they're kind of hidden away. I cover them in vines, etc. once it's done. I needed something here to prevent the guests from being able to see the lemurs as they came in through the entrance, because I had this issue with the peacock pathway that we built last episode. When I designed it, I opened it and then realised that all the guests would walk straight into the forest and then just come to a dead stop in the entrance, clogging it up as they stood and gawped at the peacocks. I fixed that eventually, but it took a lot of hiding barriers, and it wasn't ideal. So with this one, I've integrated an opaque barrier into that part of the wall from the outset to stop guests from stopping there. They'll walk straight past that bit, go up onto the raised paths, and that is where they will see the lemurs from. Now I'm putting mesh pieces up here. One of the other big concepts I had for this particular habitat is I wanted to have the lemurs visible from in the Grand Plaza, so that as people walking along, if you get lucky, you might see them swinging, well, they don't swing, jumping, running, etc. through the trees, through that mesh, and they do occasionally do that, and it looks really cool. You'll see that in the cinematics at the end, but that's probably my favourite feature of this particular habitat. And like I said at the start, it's really important to have a lot of shelter for these animals, because they're going to be happy as Larry, the lemur, in summer, and they'll be pretty much perfectly happy in spring and autumn. But come winter, once it starts getting down towards zero, they're not going to be wanting to be outside for extended periods. So there are two shelters at the back here, built into the overhang of the raised pathway around the Grand Plaza, and one of those shelters will be visible from the Grand Plaza as well, so we put viewing windows in on the Grand Plaza side, so in winter, if it is a cold day and the lemurs aren't outside, you can still see them playing around in the inside bit of the enclosure. Done a load of terrain painting as well, as per usual, to sit this all together nicely. I really wanted to get one of the roller feeders in here, because I hardly ever use them, and the animations are really cool on those, but they just destroy the terrain so much. They flatten an area of, like, I don't know, 4 square meters maybe when you put them in. And one of the concepts for this whole jungle is I don't really want flat terrain anywhere. The terrain is going to be raised, it's going to be lowered, or it's going to be bumpy like it is in this enclosure, and that just screwed everything up. So I don't use them in the end. I use the suspended foragers, I think they're called, and just recolor them so they're a bit less garish than they are normally. And then we put a load of rocks in, as per usual, to make it look a bit more interesting. A big rock over this little pond. The lemurs don't swim. I don't know if red-ruffed lemurs swim. I know ring-tailed lemurs swim, but either way they don't in this game. So that's just there for show, but obviously they can drink from it. And now we're back to the paths, and you can perhaps begin to understand the scale of the problem I left myself with here. I did eventually, and I've cut, oh my god, so much out of this video, but in that bit there you can see I've managed to start working with 3 at a time, I think it was, but even then I had to go in and individually adjust most of the pieces, so this was a good few hours work. And then decorating the inside part of the entrance, decided to put a flower wall in here, which I've never done before. Again, it's just the whole green foliage, white plaster that I put everywhere, but I guess there's just a bit more of the green than the white in this one. I think this looks really nice when you come in with this particular fence and all the plants in it. Really leads you in. Why I put plants in first and then put a trellis in, I really don't know. That was a really stupid way of doing it, but these new trellis pieces from the Africa pack are brilliant. They look so good. They're really subtle here, you can just sort of see them peeking out over the top, but I really like the look of them. Now we're on to building the shelters, or their winter quarters. So I've used wood here. This might be the first time I've used wood at all as a building material in this zoo. But I just wanted it to sort of sit into the back behind all the foliage, so it's not as noticeable as the white concrete. So before we move on to the last stage of this lemur habitat, I just want to speak a bit more about next week. It would mean so much to me and to the Kango Wildlife Ranch if our little Tekton Zoo community could make a difference to saving the cheetah and all the other work that they do over there in South Africa. So what's going to happen is there'll be a link to the GoFundMe in the description to this video and to next week's video, and there'll be instructions there on how to donate. But essentially you donate through that link, you edit your name on there to your YouTube name, and then you comment on next week's video or this week's video, whichever you like, and let me know that you've made a donation. And then next week, when we build the new habitat and the conservation centre that we're building. Anyone who donates will have their name added to the conservation centre in a donations wall, and you will be immortalised in Tekton Zoo forever. So thank you so much in advance for any help that you can give, because it is desperately needed. Anyway, back to this week, onto another sign for the temperate rainforest walk, as I'm calling this pathway, with the overlapping letters that we always use in this zoo, and again on the one-way glass back in, which looks really nice. And this is the viewing from the Grand Plaza for the Red-Ruffed Lemurs, so that when they're inside in winter the guests can still see them. Went through a lot of different designs for this, but I ended up just going with a really simple one of replacing the wall with the round windows, which just look so good, I think, and I use those a lot in this zoo. I'm going to put a window in if I can, it'll be one of those, and then some bricks to tie that in, and then we cover up the holes in the path. I didn't want the path extending into the enclosure for obvious reasons, and then there's going to be some custom signs on here to tell people about the lemurs and bring them into this area to look at them, so even if they're outside there's still some education here. I put a door on the inside, or the suggestion of a door on the inside, because in winter you wouldn't want a big open space like this. Obviously it's going to let all the heat out, so there is a retracting door here. Obviously it doesn't actually retract or do anything at all, but I just wanted it there so that you could see it and it would suggest its existence. There's the custom signs. I'm just finishing off this area, and that is the Red-Ruffed Lemur habitat done. I don't have a name for this habitat, so if you can think of a good name for this, please let me know in the comments, and if you come up with a good one, I will name the habitat that and do a little sign for it, and we'll put that up. Not next week, because next week is Kangathon, but the week after we'll put that into the zoo. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week for our special episode. Have your credit card / PayPal accounts ready. I'll leave you to enjoy the end cinematics, and bye.